Part 1. The Soul's Cry. Addiction as a Call for Meaning. Have you ever stood in front of a mirror, asking yourself why you keep returning to something that slowly destroys you? Why a part of you seems to need what the rest of you desperately wants to escape? Most people will call it addiction, but Carl Jung called it something far deeper. A cry from the soul. Addiction, he said, is not merely a disease, a disorder, or a bad habit. It is a spiritual crisis, a symptom of something sacred that has gone missing. In a world obsessed with neuroscience and quick fixes, we often reduce addiction to chemicals, dopamine receptors, or unresolved childhood trauma. These are all real, but they are not the whole story. Jung pointed to something that modern psychology often sidesteps: the void at the center of the soul, the aching emptiness we try to silence with stimulation. It's not the drink, the drug, the screen, or the gamble that the addict longs for. What they're really reaching for is relief. Relief from the unbearable silence inside. Not just the silence of boredom or loneliness, but the silence of meaninglessness. Jung wrote, "All neurosis is a substitute for legitimate suffering." And in the case of addiction, it's not that people are too lazy to change. It's that they're too wounded to keep pretending everything's fine. The pain they carry isn't just emotional, it's existential. It's the pain of disconnection from one's true self. Think of the man who drinks every night until he blacks out. To the outside world, he's irresponsible, weak-willed, but what if that man once stood at the grave of someone he loved and never cried? What if no one ever taught him how to feel grief, only how to suppress it? The bottle isn't his craving. It's the only silence he knows. Or the woman who scrolls endlessly, hour after hour, until her eyes blur. She's not addicted to the phone. She's addicted to escaping, to disappearing into something that demands nothing of her, because everything else in life feels like a performance. These are not weak people. They are exhausted people, tired of wearing masks, tired of pretending, tired of existing in a world that does not give their pain a name. From the outside, addiction looks like a choice. Just stop. People say, get help, but Jung saw through that illusion. He saw the addict not as someone escaping responsibility, but as someone escaping a life devoid of meaning. Not pain, but meaningless pain. That's a crucial difference. When suffering has meaning, we endure it. We grow through it. But when suffering feels random, absurd, or never-ending, we try to numb it. And that is where addiction begins, not in weakness, but in absence. The absence of a deeper story to hold the pain. Jung believed that humans are not machines, and suffering is not a glitch to be patched. We are symbolic beings. We need myth, ritual, purpose. Without it, our pain becomes unbearable. So we reach for anything that makes us feel, even if it hurts us. In this way, the addict is not running from life, but from a life without soul. The substance, the behavior, the fixation. They are not the problem. They are substitutes. Substitutes for connection, for ritual, for transcendence. When those are missing, addiction fills the void with illusions of meaning. And in a cruel irony, the very thing meant to silence the pain becomes its echo. So before we label someone an addict, before we reduce them to their cravings or their choices, we need to ask, what is the soul in them crying out for? What sacred thing went missing? Because Jung was clear, addiction is not the enemy, it is the message. And until we understand the message, no cure will ever be enough. Part 2. Possessed by the unspoken. Addiction and the power of the shadow. Have you ever done something and, afterward, whispered to yourself, why did I do that? That's not me. Carl Jung would gently correct you. It is you. It's just the part of you you've been hiding, and that part He called it the shadow. Addiction, Jung believed, isn't a random behavior. It's the shadow speaking when we've refused to listen. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of you you've repressed, your pain, your rage, your grief, your shame, all the things you were told were unacceptable, all the emotions you never had the space to feel. And because these parts are denied expression, they begin to fester in the dark corners of your psyche. They don't disappear. They bide their time until one day they erupt not with words, but with behavior. This is why so many people caught in addiction feel like they're watching themselves from outside their body. Why they say things like, "I don't know what came over me," because the shadow has taken the wheel. And the more you fight it, the stronger it gets. You try to be good. You aim to be strong, polished, disciplined. You perform, please, and strive. But the cost of perfection is always repression. What you don't express, you suppress. And what you suppress doesn't dissolve, it grows claws. That's why addiction can feel like being possessed. You don't want another drink, another scroll, another binge, but you do it anyway. Not because you're weak, but because some part of you is desperate to be heard. Addiction, in this light, is the shadow's way of screaming for recognition. Take the example of Alex, a high achiever with a perfect resume and a deepening addiction to prescription pills. His co-workers admire his discipline. His family sees him as dependable. But beneath that facade is a man who never cried after his father left, who never processed the abuse he endured, who never said, "I'm angry," because boys like him were told to man up, not break down. So his rage didn't vanish. It simply found another voice. In the quiet of the night, when no one's watching, the shadow takes over. And in that moment, the pills don't offer pleasure. They offer permission. Permission to stop pretending, to stop performing. Permission to finally feel, even if only for a fleeting moment. Here lies the paradox. The shadow isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to reunite you with your buried truth. But if you keep fighting it, if you label your urges as evil, your feelings as weakness, your memories as irrelevant, you remain split. One half of you tries to heal, while the other half sabotages your every step. You live at war with yourself. Jung warned us, what you resist persists. The more we push away our shadow, the more power it gains. The answer, then, is not to destroy the shadow, but to integrate it. Integration means sitting with your grief without numbing it, listening to your rage without being consumed by it, letting your shame speak, not as a dictator, but as a witness. When you do this, something sacred happens. The behavior begins to shift, not through force, but through understanding. Suddenly, the cravings lose their bite. The urgency fades, not because you're resisting harder, but because you're finally listening. Esantika and the shadow, once acknowledged, begins to soften. It no longer needs to scream through your addiction because you've given it a voice. You are not possessed. You are not broken. You are simply living with a part of yourself you've never been taught to love. And when you turn toward your shadow, not with judgment, but with curiosity, you begin something few ever dare to do. You begin the sacred work of becoming whole. Part 3. The necessary fall. When collapse becomes calling. What if I told you that the worst day of your life, the moment everything collapsed, wasn't a failure, but an invitation? What if rock bottom wasn't the end, but the threshold to something sacred? Carl Jung didn't see rock bottom as a place of shame. He saw it as a symbolic death, the crumbling of the false self, so the real self could finally emerge. Most people spend their lives trying to stay in control, avoiding collapse, numbing discomfort, clinging to routines that keep the ego afloat. The world applauds this. We call it resilience, productivity, strength. But there comes a point when the performance can no longer be maintained. The masks crack. The lies we tell ourselves no longer hold. The bottle doesn't numb like it used to. The dopamine fades faster than it arrives. The distractions stop working. This is the brink, the edge, where addiction stops soothing and starts suffocating. The moment you can no longer outrun your own truth. Jung understood that this collapse is not a punishment. It is a rite of passage. In myths across cultures, the hero must descend into the underworld. In alchemy, the material must be burned down before it can be transformed into gold. In psychology, the ego must die before the self can rise. Rock bottom is the underworld of the soul's journey. It is the place where you no longer have the energy to pretend, where the identity you've built, the hero, the strong one, the successful one, shatters under the weight of unspoken grief. And in that shattering, something eternal begins to stir. Consider Maya, a woman in her mid-30s, who had been silently battling a hidden addiction to sleeping pills. She kept her career afloat, paid her bills, and smiled at family dinners. On the outside, everything appeared fine, until one night, she forgot how many pills she'd taken. She woke up in the hospital, confused, humiliated, surrounded by worried faces. That night, she lost her job, her relationship, and the carefully constructed image of control she had worked so hard to maintain. But years later, she doesn't call that night her failure. She calls it her rebirth. Because it was only when she had nothing left to protect that she finally asked the most important question. Who am I without the mask? Jung called this process the symbolic death. Not a literal ending, but a psychological crucifixion, the dying of the egoic roles we cling to, so the deeper self can emerge. This is why rock bottom is sacred. It tears away illusion. It forces truth. It strips us of every false identity, so we can finally stand naked before the mirror of the soul. And though it feels like death, it is the soil of rebirth. The tragedy isn't in falling. The real danger lies in hovering just above rock bottom for years, functional but hollow, alive but unawakened, working, smiling, numbing, too afraid to collapse, but too lost to rise. That half-life is where many addicts get stuck, never broken enough to change, never whole enough to heal. It's the limbo of quiet suffering. But when everything finally collapses, when the lie no longer holds, then something extraordinary becomes possible. Rock bottom doesn't destroy you. It reveals you. And in that raw moment of exposure, a choice must be made. Evolve or perish. Not perish in the physical sense, but perish as the false self, as the persona you used to survive, as the mask you wore to be accepted. And if you choose to evolve not through willpower, but through surrender, then rock bottom becomes something else entirely. It becomes holy ground, because when all else is stripped away, you meet the only thing real enough to rebuild a life upon, the truth of who you really are. Part 4, Beyond the High. Addiction as a symbol of sacred longing. The addict isn't chasing pleasure. They're chasing meaning, even if they don't know it. They don't crave the drug, the bottle, or the screen. They crave relief, a moment where the chaos of existence goes silent, even if only for a breath. Carl Jung understood this hunger not as pathology, but as a spiritual yearning. Addiction, he said, is what happens when the soul is starving and the world offers no real food. Most people think addicts are after stimulation, but they're not. They're chasing pause, relief, stillness, a moment where the pressure to perform, please, and pretend finally stops, a moment where they can feel something real or nothing at all. When you strip away the object of addiction, whether it's alcohol, porn, pills, or social media, you'll find the same thing underneath every time. A human being trying to feel whole, trying to feel safe, trying to remember what it means to be alive without shame. But our culture doesn't teach us how to be whole. It teaches us how to perform wholeness. It rewards noise over depth, image over authenticity, progress over presence, and when real silence becomes unbearable, fake silence becomes addictive. Once upon a time, human beings had rituals. We had symbols, myths, initiations. We had sacred pauses, moments when grief could be held, when identity could be reimagined, when pain had a place. But in our modern world, those rituals have been stripped away, replaced with screens, appointments, algorithms. There's no village elder, no shaman, no sacred circle where the ache inside us can be named. So what happens? The bottle becomes the altar. The needle becomes the prayer. The scroll becomes the chant. And the addict becomes the priest of their own private, secret ritual. Imagine a young man named Liam. He grew up without a father, in a household where emotions were seen as weakness. No one ever told him what to do with his sadness. No one ever taught him how to be with his own fear. At 17, he discovers opioids after a sports injury. But it's not the high he falls in love with. It's the quiet, the safety, the sense of being held by something, anything. Soon, it's no longer just a pill. It's a ritual. He doesn't take it to get high. He takes it to come home. But that home is made of illusions, and the cost of returning to it rises every day. Jung taught that the psyche is symbolic by nature. If it cannot access a real transformation, it will simulate one. That's what addiction is, a counterfeit initiation. The high mimics transcendence. The crash mimics death. The craving mimics longing for the divine. But it never completes the ritual. It starts a cycle without a conclusion, a spiral without a center. The addict keeps coming back, not because they're foolish, but because they're loyal to a hunger they don't yet know how to feed. And the more the culture dismisses that hunger, the more seductive the substitute becomes. The real tragedy is that many addicts go through life thinking their craving is shameful. They hide it, they fight it, they hate themselves for it. But Jung would say, that longing is not your enemy. It is your soul trying to remember the sacred. The ache beneath addiction is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the oldest part of you, calling out for what this world has forgotten to give. Ritual, connection, silence that heals instead of numbs. So if you're struggling, if you feel broken by a craving, you can't explain pause before you condemn yourself. Ask instead, what sacred thing went missing? What ritual was I never given? What part of me is starving for meaning, not medicine? Because addiction isn't just a behavior, it's a symbol, pointing to what's been exiled. It's your psyche's way of saying, I am still searching. I still remember something deeper exists. You're not just chasing a high, you're chasing home. And once you understand that, the journey out of addiction isn't just recovery, it's a return. Part 5, Healing the Split. The journey from fragmentation to wholeness. What if the goal isn't to get sober, but to become someone who no longer needs to escape? Carl Jung didn't believe healing was about discipline or denial. He believed true healing was about integration, bringing back the exiled parts of ourselves and restoring inner unity. Because you don't just heal by saying no to the substance. You heal by saying yes to the parts of yourself you were taught to silence. There are people who stop drinking but are still tormented by shame. People who never touch a drug again, but walk through life emotionally numb. People who go to therapy, journal, meditate, but never touch the part of themselves that's still split in half. This is what Jung warned us about: mistaking behavioral change for transformation. Real healing isn't about white-knuckling your way through abstinence. It's about turning around and asking, what did this craving protect me from? What truth have I been too afraid to face? Addiction is never random. It's a compass, pointing to the places we stopped feeling safe being ourselves. Most people walk through life with pieces of themselves missing. The angry child they were told to hide, the grieving teenager who was never comforted, the scared adult who's been pretending to be strong for too long. These parts don't disappear. They hide in the unconscious. They become symptoms. They show up as panic, rage, withdrawal, addiction, and the healing. It begins the moment we stop trying to amputate these parts and start welcoming them back into the circle. Jung famously said, "The gold is in the shadow." What does that mean? It means the very parts of yourself you're trying to kill off: your anger, your shame, your grief also carry your power, your authenticity, your creative fire, that rage you repress. It's also your boundary, that sadness you bury. It's also your tenderness, that craving you hate. It's also your soul's signal that something is missing. Integration means recognizing these signals, not silencing them. It means becoming a safe place for your full humanity, not just the parts the world approves of. Let's look at David. He was 10 years sober, held a job, sponsored others in recovery, and yet felt emotionally numb. He had done everything right, but something was still missing. Then in a therapy session, he broke down talking about his mother's death. He realized he had never truly grieved. He had recovered, but never integrated the grief that led him to drink in the first place. That moment didn't just change his healing, it changed his identity. He no longer saw himself as the addict who beat addiction. He saw himself as the child who was never comforted. Finally, learning how to hold himself. That's integration. When you begin to integrate your shadow, something radical happens. You stop fighting cravings because they lose their purpose. They were never the enemy. They were the messenger. And once the message is received, they no longer need to scream. Suddenly, you don't need to run. You don't need to numb. You don't need to perform. You become undivided. And in that wholeness, peace is no longer something you chase. It becomes who you are. Integration isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's choosing to stay with yourself when the old story tells you to run. It's learning to sit with your cravings, not as threats, but as parts of you trying to come home. It's refusing to amputate the pain and instead asking it what it wants to teach you. Because the goal is not sobriety. The goal is wholeness, not to avoid temptation forever, but to become someone who no longer needs it. Not to banish your shadow, but to welcome it as a sacred part of your becoming. That's what Jung meant when he said, healing is not about becoming good. It's about becoming whole. Part 6, the sacred return. Reclaiming the self beyond addiction. You are not your worst day. You are not your relapse. You are not the cravings that come in the dark. You are the one who knows something deeper is possible. And that knowing, that persistent inner whisper, is the beginning of a myth most people never dare to live. Carl Jung didn't believe in labels like junkie or lost cause. He believed every addiction is a misunderstood myth, a sacred story trying to be lived properly. In every great myth, the hero falls. They're cast out. They descend into the underworld. They lose themselves before they ever find the treasure. The same is true for the addict. The substance is not the dragon. The dragon is self-deception. The dragon is the refusal to feel, to face the pain, to speak the truth of what was buried. And the moment the addict stops running from that dragon and looks it in the eyes is the moment a new identity begins to stir. Not the addict, not the survivor, but the one who remembers who they are. Jung taught that transformation isn't cognitive, it's symbolic. The addict doesn't heal by memorizing facts or repeating affirmations. They heal the moment they experience a symbol, a vision, a dream, a breakdown, or a story that makes their suffering mean something. That's why myths matter, because they give shape to pain. They help the unconscious speak in images when words fail. The addict's turning point isn't just sobriety. It's the day they realize, I wasn't trying to destroy myself. I was trying to come home to something sacred. Think of Tara. After years of heroin use, countless failed rehabs, and an overdose that nearly ended her life, something unexpected happened. It wasn't a program that finally broke the cycle. It was a dream. In the dream, she saw a version of herself young, radiant, barefoot standing in a field of wildflowers. She reached out her hand and said, I'm still here. That image stuck with Tara. It haunted her, not in fear, but in invitation. She began to paint. She wrote letters to her younger self. She wept for the first time in years. And slowly, the addiction that once defined her began to loosen its grip because something stronger had returned. Meaning, addiction is fragmentation. Recovery, at its deepest, is not about quitting. It's about remembering who you were before the silence, before the shame, before the world convinced you that your hunger was a problem instead of a prayer. You are not broken. You are disoriented. But inside, you is a blueprint, a memory, a map written in myth and symbol, waiting to be uncovered. And once you begin that journey not out of fear, but out of love, you step into something Jung held sacred, the individuation process, the lifelong path of becoming the self you were always meant to be. You've heard the phrase, the hero returns with the fire. That's what you're doing now. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to become whole, to face the dragon, retrieve your truth, and come back with light, not just for yourself, but for others lost in the dark. Because when you reclaim the parts of you that were exiled, when you stop mistaking your craving for your identity, you become dangerous to the systems that profit from your numbness. You start speaking with clarity, loving without fear, living without shame, and the world won't always understand it, but your soul will, because it never wanted the high. It wanted home, and now you've begun the journey back.